This is Mr. Eugene, and today we're examining a phenomenon happening quietly among men over 60 that psychologists are only beginning to fully understand, and that society has almost completely misread. Men who were once social, present, engaged, and connected are suddenly withdrawing, cutting off friends, distancing from family, stepping back from relationships they spent decades building, declining invitations they once accepted automatically, becoming unreachable to people who once had unlimited access, and the people around them are calling it depression, calling it bitterness, calling it isolation, calling it a cry for help. But what if they're wrong? What if what looks like withdrawal from the outside is actually something far more intentional and far more psychologically sophisticated than anyone around these men is willing to acknowledge? What if this isn't men falling apart, but men finally pulling themselves together after 60 years of living for everyone else? What if this isn't the beginning of decline, but the beginning of the most honest, most authentic, most fully lived chapter of their entire lives? Today we're examining what's actually happening inside the mind of a man over 60 who decides to cut everyone off, the 8 psychological drivers that create this withdrawal, why this is almost never impulsive but the conclusion of decades of observation, how energy economics change fundamentally at this age, the role of accumulated disappointment that was never processed, the discovery of solitude as necessity rather than punishment, why integrity consolidation demands cutting off people who violate values, the permission these men finally give themselves, and most critically, why this deserves deep respect rather than concern, intervention, or attempts to fix what isn't broken. This is not about depression, this is not about bitterness, this is not about men giving up on life, this is about men who've lived long enough to understand what actually matters and having the courage to act on that understanding without apology or explanation. Stay with me. This will completely change how you see the older men in your life who've gone quiet. The critical misunderstanding, what society gets wrong. Let me start by addressing the fundamental misinterpretation that causes all the concern, what it looks like from outside to family, friends, people who've known him for decades. He's not returning calls like he used to. He's declining invitations he would have accepted before. He's not initiating contact anymore. He's become harder to reach. He seems distant, unavailable, withdrawn. He's cutting off people he's known for 30-plus years. He's spending more time alone. He's not participating in family events, the immediate interpretation. Something's wrong, he's depressed, he's isolating, he needs help, we need to intervene, we need to bring him back. What's actually happening inside, but here's what they're not seeing, this is almost never an impulsive decision. When a man over 60 cuts people off, it's rarely a sudden reaction to a single event or crisis. It's the conclusion of a very long internal process that most people around him never even noticed was happening. For years, sometimes decades, this man has been quietly observing patterns in his relationships, quietly evaluating what he gives versus what he receives, quietly measuring which relationships drain him and which feed him, quietly registering every disappointment, every betrayal, every moment when someone he trusted showed him who they actually were beneath the version they performed for him, quietly noticing which people only contact him when they need something, quietly tracking which relationships are reciprocal and which are extractive, quietly understanding which people genuinely care about him and which care about what he provides, and one day, all of that quiet observation reaches a conclusion. Most of what surrounds him is not worth the cost of maintaining it. That's not depression, that's not anger, that's not a cry for help, that's not a man falling apart. That's 60 years of pattern recognition arriving at its most honest and most uncomfortable conclusion. And once a man reaches that conclusion, once he sees clearly what he's been observing quietly for decades, there is absolutely no going back from it. Driver 1, the energy economics shift. Now let me detail the specific psychological drivers that create this withdrawal. Starting with the most fundamental, the energy transformation by 60%, a man has a fundamentally different relationship with his energy than he did at 30 or 40 at 30. Energy feels infinite. You can give freely, and trust more will arrive tomorrow. Recovery from depletion is fast. You can maintain dozens of relationships without exhaustion. Social obligation feels manageable. You have surplus to waste on people who don't deserve it at 60. Energy is finite and precious. Recovery from depletion takes days, not hours. Every interaction has costs that must be calculated. Maintaining relationships requires energy you no longer have in abundance. Social obligation feels oppressive rather than normal. You have no surplus to waste. Every single person and situation in his life is either adding to his energy or subtracting from it. There is no neutral. There is no relationship that costs nothing. The honest accounting. When a man over 60 does the honest accounting of who in his life is adding and who is subtracting, the results are often deeply uncomfortable. The subtractors are frequently people he's known the longest, people he loves most, family members he's supported for decades, friends he's been loyal to for 40 plus years, people he thought would be there for him the way he's been there for them, and cutting them off is not about loving them less. It's about finally loving himself enough to stop paying a price he can no longer afford. That distinction is one that most people around him will never fully understand, but he understands it completely. And that understanding changes absolutely everything about how he moves through the world from that point forward. Driver 2. The shifting time horizon effect. The second driver is what researchers call the shifting time horizon effect. The psychological shift when people are young, they tend to prioritize expanding their social networks, meeting new people constantly, building new connections, collecting relationships the way they collect experiences, breadth over depth, quantity over quality. This makes evolutionary sense. When time feels infinite, casting a wide net creates opportunities, security, possibilities. But as people age and begin to perceive their remaining time as more limited, something fundamental shifts in what they prioritize. The natural pruning process research consistently shows that older adults deliberately prune their social worlds, not because they're depressed, but because they're being strategic about limited remaining time. Become far more selective about who they spend time with. Quality over quantity becomes the dominant principle. Focus on depth over breadth. A few genuinely meaningful connections become more valuable than many superficial ones. Prioritize emotional satisfaction over social expansion. They stop collecting people and start investing in relationships that actually matter. What looks like cutting people off from the outside is often just this natural and psychologically healthy pruning process happening in real time. The man is not withdrawing from life. He's not giving up on people. He's not becoming antisocial or difficult or damaged. He's curating his world with the precision and intentionality that only comes from having lived long enough to know exactly what actually matters, and having the courage to act on that knowledge without apology or explanation. Driver 3, accumulated unprocessed disappointment. The third driver is the accumulated weight of unprocessed disappointment. The generational context men over 60 grew up in a generation that was explicitly taught, don't process emotions, don't talk about pain, don't acknowledge disappointment, don't grieve relationships that let you down, don't burden others with your feelings, handle everything internally, show no weakness, keep moving forward. So for decades, these men carried every disappointment quietly, every friendship that turned out to be conditional. I thought he was my friend, but when I needed him, he disappeared. When he needed me, I was always there. Every family member who only showed up when they needed something. She calls when she needs money, advice, help, but when I'm struggling, radio silence. Every person who took their loyalty for granted. I showed up for him for 30 years. He couldn't show up for me once when it mattered. Every relationship that consistently cost more than it gave, I'm always giving, always accommodating, always adjusting. What am I actually getting in return? They carried all of it without ever putting it down, talking it through, or asking anyone for help with the weight of it. The breaking point, and at some point in their 60s, that accumulated weight becomes impossible to carry alongside the relationships that created it. Cutting people off is not always anger. Sometimes it's not even a conscious choice. Sometimes it's not about the other person at all. Sometimes it's simply the only way a man who was never taught to process pain knows how to finally put it down and breathe again. And the relief that comes with that first breath, the first moment of not carrying weight he carried for decades, is something he will spend the rest of his life protecting with everything he has. Driver 4. The discovery of solitude as necessity. The fourth driver is the discovery of solitude as a genuine need rather than a punishment. The transformation for most of their lives, men over 60 experience solitude as something imposed on them, something to be avoided, something that signaled failure, something that indicated rejection, something that meant inadequacy, punishment rather than privilege. But somewhere in their 60 seconds, many men discover for the first time that solitude is not the absence of something good. It's the presence of something extraordinary, What they find in solitude. It's in solitude that they hear their own thoughts clearly for the first time in decades. No one else's voice, agenda, needs drowning out their internal voice. They remember who they were before all the roles began, before husband, father, provider, employee, friend. Who was he? He's rediscovering that person. They finally meet themselves as they actually are rather than as others need them to be. Stripped of performance, obligation, expectation, this is who I am. They experience peace that's been missing for 40+ years, the constant low-level stress of managing others' needs and expectations gone. They reconnect with interests and pursuits abandoned decades ago, things he gave up to accommodate others. He's reclaiming them. They think without interruption, creative thoughts, reflections, processing, all require uninterrupted mental space that solitude provides, the protection that follows. Once a man discovers that quality of inner silence and realizes what has been living inside it all along, the relationships that used to fill that space start to feel less like connection and more like interruption. And protecting that silence becomes one of the most important and most deliberate commitments he has ever made to himself. This isn't isolation, this is intentional solitude. And the difference is everything. Driver 5. Integrity consolidation. The fifth driver is what psychologists call integrity consolidation, the clarity that comes with age. By 60. Most men have a very clear and hard-earned sense of their own values, what they believe, what they stand for, what they will and will not tolerate, what constitutes acceptable behavior, what loyalty actually means, what honesty looks like, what integrity requires, and they have also spent decades watching certain people in their lives consistently violate those values. Friends who are dishonest, lying, manipulating, presenting false versions of themselves in situations. Family members who are manipulative, using guilt as a tool, loyalty as a weapon, vulnerability as an opening to take advantage. People who are takers but never givers, always asking, never offering, always needing, never providing. People whose words and actions never align. They say the right things but behave completely differently. People who violate trust repeatedly, second chances, third chances, 10th chances. All violated the same way, the decision. At some point in their 60s, men stop having the patience for the gap between who they are and who the people around them keep proving themselves to be. They stop making excuses for it. Well, that's just how he is. She's family, so I have to accept it. He's been my friend for 40 years, so I can't cut him off now. They stop trying to work around it. No more carefully managing conversations to avoid triggering manipulation. No more protecting themselves from people who should be safe. They stop pretending it's not happening. The dishonesty, the manipulation, the taking, the violation of values, they stop pretending it's acceptable. Cutting those people off is not cruelty. It's not abandonment. It's integrity. It's a man deciding that his values are no longer available to be compromised by people who never shared them to begin with and never intended to. And that decision is one of the most psychologically healthy and self-affirming things a man over 60 can do for himself. Driver 6. Finally, giving themselves permission. The sixth driver is the profound psychological impact of finally giving themselves permission. The rules they never wrote for 60 years, most of these men operated under a set of rules they never wrote and never agreed to. Be available, always accessible, always responsive. Be reliable, never let anyone down. Always deliver, show up, for everyone, for everything, regardless of cost to yourself. Give more, your time, your energy, your resources. Give until it hurts. Ask for less, minimize your needs, don't burden others. Sacrifice quietly your dreams, your preferences, your comfort, without complaint. Perform consistently. Maintain the facade regardless of internal state. Never complain, handle everything stoically. Never need too much. Be low maintenance despite giving high maintenance support to everyone else. These rules were imposed by culture, family expectations, gender norms, social pressure, work requirements, relationship dynamics, but he never agreed to them. He just followed them because that's what men did. The liberation, and the moment he finally gives himself permission to stop following rules that were never in his best interest, something shifts in him at a fundamental level that cannot be undone. The cutting off is not just about the people being cut off. It's about a man exercising a kind of personal authority over his own life that he was never allowed to exercise before. It's the first truly free decision many of these men have ever made entirely for themselves. And the psychological relief that comes with it is so profound and so immediate that it reinforces every subsequent decision to protect that freedom at all costs going forward. He's not being selfish, he's finally being self-full after 60 years of being selfless. Driver 7, the realization about reciprocity. The 7th driver is the painful realization about reciprocity, or its absence, the patterns he finally sees after 60 years of relationships. The patterns become undeniable. Pattern 1, the one-way street. I've been there for him through 3 divorces, 2 job losses, his father's death, his bankruptcy. I needed him once, really needed him, and he was too busy. The reciprocity I assumed existed never did. Pattern 2, the conditional connection. She's warm and loving when I'm providing money, time, emotional support, problem solving, but when I'm struggling and have nothing to give, she disappears. The love I thought was unconditional was entirely transactional. Pattern 3, the extractive relationship. I spent 40 years being the listener, the advisor, the supporter. Did they ever once ask how I was doing? Did they notice when I was struggling? Or did they just keep extracting what they needed without ever checking if I had anything left? Pattern 4, the performative loyalty. They call themselves my family, my friends, my people, but when it actually mattered, when I needed something, when I was vulnerable, when I was in crisis, where were they? Loyalty is a word they use, not a principle they live. The conclusion: once he sees these patterns clearly, once he acknowledges what he's been quietly observing for decades, continuing the relationships becomes impossible. Not because he's angry, but because he can no longer unsee what he's seen. And maintaining relationships with people who've demonstrated they don't actually care about him, only about what he provides, becomes an act of self-betrayal he's no longer willing to commit. Driver 8. This is rebuilding, not ending. The 8th and most misunderstood driver is that cutting everyone off is frequently the beginning of a rebuilding process rather than an ending, what he's actually doing. The men who withdraw most completely are often the ones who are most intentional about what they're building in the space that withdrawal creates. They're not disappearing. They're clearing ground. They're making room for something more honest, more genuine, and more aligned with who they've actually become after 60 years of living. What gets built in the cleared space, authentic relationships? The few people who survive the pruning are those who've proven themselves through decades. These become deeper, richer, more meaningful than any relationships he had before. Genuine interests, pursuits he abandoned to accommodate others. He's reclaiming and developing them now. Woodworking, painting, writing, music, whatever he sacrificed for decades. Real peace, environment structured entirely around his preferences, needs, rhythms. No one to accommodate, no one to manage, just peace. Self-knowledge, time, and space to understand himself at depths he never had opportunity to explore when his life was consumed by others' needs. Purpose aligned with values. Instead of living according to others' expectations, he's building life around what he actually believes matters. The relationships that survive this pruning process are almost always the strongest and most authentic connections these men have ever had in their entire lives, because they were chosen deliberately and carefully by a man who finally knew exactly what he valued and had the courage and self-respect to settle for absolutely nothing less than that. And the life that gets built in that cleared space is often the most meaningful and most fully inhabited life these men have ever lived. What this actually is, the psychological reality. Here's what the psychology actually tells us about men over 60 who cut everyone off. They are not broken. Their discernment is functioning perfectly. They're seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time. Bitterness is unprocessed disappointment. This is fully processed and acted upon. Depression is characterized by anhedonia, inability to experience pleasure. These men often report feeling more alive, more present, more content than they have in decades. Giving up on human connection, they're eliminating inauthentic connection to make space for authentic connection. Damaged by their past, they're liberated by understanding their past clearly. Afraid of their future, they're actively creating the future they want, rather than accepting what others expect. People to be pitied or fixed or talked out of their decisions, they're making the most psychologically sophisticated and self-aware choices of their lives. They are applying 60 years of accumulated wisdom, pattern recognition, lived experience, hard-earned self-knowledge, protecting finite remaining energy, strategic allocation of limited resources, honoring their values, refusing to compromise integrity for social obligation, choosing quality over quantity, depth over breadth in relationships, exercising personal authority, making decisions for themselves, possibly for first time, building authentic life, creating existence aligned with actual values rather than imposed expectations, demonstrating profound self-respect, valuing themselves enough to eliminate what doesn't serve them. Who gets cut off, and why the people who get cut off are not random? They're the answer to specific questions. The questions he's finally asking. Question 1, does this relationship make my life better or worse? Not, have I known this person a long time? Not, are they family? Does this relationship actually improve my life or diminish it? Question 2, is this relationship reciprocal or extractive? Do they give as much as they take? Or am I perpetually on the giving end with minimal reciprocation? Question 3, do they respect my values or violate them? Do their actions align with principles I hold sacred? Or do they consistently demonstrate values incompatible with mine? Question 4, do they see me or just what I provide? Are they interested in me as a person? Or am I just a resource they access when needed? Question 5, would they be there if I needed them? Have they proven through actions that they'd support me the way I've supported them? Or is the support one-directional? Who gets cut? Those who fail these questions. Family members who only call when they need money. Friends who talk endlessly about their problems but never ask about his. People who've demonstrated through decades that their love is conditional on his provision. Individuals who violate his values while expecting him to accommodate theirs. Anyone who's proven they reciprocate the loyalty he's given, and for the first time in 60 years, he has the strength, the clarity, the self-awareness, and the self-respect to act on the answer regardless of what anyone else thinks about it. What this deserves? Respect, not intervention. This is where society needs to fundamentally shift its response, stop treating this as problem it's not, depression requiring medication, isolation requiring intervention, bitterness requiring counseling, withdrawal requiring rescue, problem requiring fixing. Start recognizing this as wisdom it is. Discernment developed over decades, healthy boundary setting, strategic life optimization, self-respect in action, courage to live authentically, wisdom applied to relationships. What he needs from you, not concern, intervention, attempts to reconnect him with people he deliberately disconnected from, pressure to explain or justify, judgment about his choices, efforts to bring him back. Instead, respect for his decisions, trust in his judgment, space to live as he chooses, acknowledgement that he knows his life better than you do, support if he asks for it, otherwise, leave him in peace. Final thoughts. This is success, not failure. Here's what everyone needs to understand about men over 60 who cut everyone off. This is not something to be fixed. This is not something to be mourned. This is something to be deeply and unconditionally respected. These men are doing something far more sophisticated and far more intentional than the labels of depression or isolation suggest. They're applying 6 decades of accumulated wisdom, lived experience, and hard-earned self-knowledge to the one area of their lives where they were never allowed to apply it before: their own well-being, their own peace, their own future. The people who get cut off are not victims of a man who stopped caring. They're the answer to questions a man over 60 finally had the courage to ask honestly: does this relationship serve me or drain me? Has this person earned the place they hold in my life? If I met them today, would I choose them? Am I maintaining this relationship out of genuine connection or out of obligation, history, or guilt? And for the first time in 60 years, he had the courage to act on the honest answers. This is not failure. This is success. Success is not maintaining relationships that destroy you. Success is building a life that genuinely fits who you are. These men are finally, after 6 decades, building lives aligned with their actual values instead of others' expectations. That's not something to fix, that's something to celebrate. Drop a comment about your experience. Have you watched an older man go through this? Are you the man going through it yourself? What does this make you realize about the older men in your life? Subscribe, because this channel will continue examining life transitions that look like problems but are actually profound wisdom in action. Stay true, stay clear, and never let anyone shame you for finally choosing yourself after 60 years of choosing everyone else